Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Night Story, and welcome to tonight's journey toward peaceful sleep. If you're enjoying this content, I would be so grateful if you could take a moment to like this video. I'd also love to hear from you. Please feel free to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your kind support truly helps me continue creating these relaxing experiences for you. Now, please make yourself comfortable as we gently begin tonight's journey to restful sleep. The smell of microwave popcorn filled Jade's apartment as I settled onto her plush couch, wrapped in the throw blanket I'd claimed as my own over years of friendship. It was October 2022, and at 28, I found these quiet nights increasingly precious as adult responsibilities consumed more of our lives. Her apartment was cozy despite its disorganization. String lights illuminated stacks of books and half-finished craft projects, while photos of our college adventures covered nearly every wall space. "I've missed this," I said, watching her arrange snacks on the coffee table. "Work has been absolute torture lately." Jade nodded as she poured wine into mismatched glasses. "Tell me about it. The promotion sounds great until you're drowning in spreadsheets at midnight." We hadn't seen each other in nearly 2 months, our longest gap since becoming friends in freshman year. The plan was simple: comfort food, nostalgic movies, and absolutely no discussion of our professional lives. Her apartment perfectly reflected her personality, chaotic but inviting. Empty coffee mugs collected on bookshelves beside carefully tended plants, and her collection of vintage movie posters gave the space a unique charm. "I cleaned for 3 hours before you got here," she confessed, noticing my glance at the scattered magazines. "This is actually the presentable version." I laughed. "You should see my place. I'm pretty sure something's evolving in my refrigerator at this point." As Jade scrolled through streaming options, I sank deeper into the couch. The familiar comfort of our friendship temporarily masked the exhaustion that had been my constant companion for weeks. Outside, rain began to tap against the windows, creating the perfect backdrop for our evening. "So, dinner," Jade announced, putting down the remote. "I was thinking pizza. That place on Westmore that we used to love just started delivering to this neighborhood." "Perfect," I agreed, already imagining the garlic knots that had sustained us through countless study sessions. "My treat this time." Jade hesitated slightly, her fingers hovering over her phone. "Actually, I've got this guy who might be bringing it over." She caught my expression and quickly added, "Not like that. He's just, well, you'll see. His name is Gordon. He helps me out sometimes." I raised an eyebrow. "Helps you out? That sounds suspiciously like you've acquired a personal assistant." "It's not like that," she insisted, though her tone suggested otherwise. "He's just really helpful." Little did I understand the true meaning behind her words or how significantly this helpful stranger would alter the course of our lives. When the doorbell rang 40 minutes later, Jade jumped up with unexpected nervousness. "That'll be Gordon with the food," she said, smoothing her sweatpants as if suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. "Just the delivery guy," I mumbled, slightly annoyed at the interruption to our evening. I had assumed we'd be alone. The man who entered carried more than just pizza boxes. An immediate atmosphere of awkwardness followed him into the room. Tall, thin, with darting eyes that never quite settled on anything. He appeared to be in his early 30s, dressed in a neatly pressed button-down shirt that seemed oddly formal for delivering food. "Hi, Gordon," Jade greeted him with excessive warmth. "Thanks so much for doing this." "No problem at all," he replied, his voice softer than his frame would suggest. He placed the boxes on the counter with careful precision. "I got extra napkins like you asked, and those breadsticks from the place across town that you mentioned last week." I noticed he'd brought items from 2 different restaurants, a detail that struck me as strange for ordinary delivery. "Gordon, this is my friend," Jade introduced us. "We've known each other since college." His eyes finally connected with mine, and I felt a strange sensation, like being examined rather than seen. "Nice to meet you," he said, extending a hand that was unexpectedly cold. "Likewise." I responded automatically, discomfort building as he held the handshake several seconds too long. Gordon has been amazingly helpful since I moved to this neighborhood, Jade explained, her tone suggesting she wanted me to approve of him. He knows everyone and everything around here. Gordon's posture changed subtly at the praise, standing straighter as a hint of smile formed. Just trying to be neighborly. The conversation stalled into uncomfortable silence before Gordon suddenly asked, "Do you live nearby too?" Before I could formulate a vague answer, Jade supplied, "She's over on Riverview in those new apartments." I shot her a look of betrayal as Gordon nodded, mentally filing away this information. That's a nice area. Great running trails behind those buildings. The implication that he knew my neighborhood in detail made me uneasy. "Maybe we could exchange numbers," he suggested, phone already in hand, "in case you ever need anything delivered or help with, well, anything at all." With Jade watching expectantly, I reluctantly recited my number, which Gordon saved with meticulous attention. "Well, I should let you enjoy your evening," he finally said, though he made no immediate move toward the door. "Thanks again, Gordon. Drive safe," Jade prompted, finally giving him the cue to leave. When the door closed behind him, I turned to Jade with widened eyes. What was that about? She busied herself with the pizza boxes. "He's just really helpful. Picks up groceries, does errands. It started when I needed help moving a bookshelf, and now he's your unpaid servant who knows where I live," I finished. "He's harmless," she insisted. "Just lonely, I think. No social skills, but desperately wants friends." As we settled back with our food, I couldn't shake the sensation of Gordon's cold handshake or the way his eyes had cataloged every detail of my appearance. Despite Jade's assurances, something about Gordon felt deeply wrong, a feeling I would later wish I had trusted more fully. Within hours of meeting Gordon, my phone buzzed with a new group message. "Created new chat, weekend friends." Read the notification, followed by Gordon's first message. A meme about pizza that wasn't particularly funny. "He added you to our chat," Jade texted privately. "Sorry. He does this." Over the next weeks, Gordon maintained a careful digital presence, sending just enough messages to remain connected without crossing into obvious harassment. His strategy seemed calculated: a funny video on Tuesday, a local news story on Thursday, an offer of assistance every Saturday morning like clockwork. "Need any help this weekend?" became his refrain, accompanied by lists of errands he could run or tasks he could complete. I consistently declined with brief politeness. "All good this weekend, but thanks." His responses were always immediate and excessive. "No problem at all. Just let me know if anything changes. Happy to help anytime. Enjoy your weekend." The exclamation points felt like tiny shouts of desperation. Through Jade, I learned more about Gordon's involvement in her life. He had somehow integrated himself into her routine, delivering groceries she never requested, appearing with coffee when she casually mentioned being tired, offering rides when her car was in the shop. "Doesn't it concern you?" I asked during one of our phone calls. "How much he knows about your schedule?" "Sometimes," she admitted, "but it's also really convenient. And he never asks for anything in return." "That's what worries me," I replied. "People usually want something." When Gordon began referencing details I'd mentioned in conversations with Jade, my dislike of mushrooms, my work schedule, a planned trip to visit my parents, I realized he was extracting information indirectly. His knowledge accumulated in small, seemingly innocuous pieces. My favorite coffee shop, my running route, my car's make and model, my apartment building's layout. Each detail insignificant alone but disturbing in aggregate. I began carefully filtering information shared with Jade, knowing it might reach Gordon. This caution proved justified when he sent a "get well soon" message after I'd called in sick to work, information I'd only shared with my boss and Jade. The persistent offers of help continued until, in a moment of poor judgment I would come to deeply regret, I finally accepted. The washing machine in my apartment building had been broken for 2 weeks when I spotted a reasonably priced replacement on an online marketplace. The problem, I had no way to transport it, and professional installation was beyond my budget. During a moment of frustration, I mentioned this in the group chat. Gordon's response was instantaneous. "I can help. I have a truck and know how to install washing machines. When would work for you?" After a day of deliberation and Jade's assurance that Gordon had helped her with similar tasks, I reluctantly agreed. "That would be really helpful, actually. Are you sure it's not too much trouble?" "No trouble at all. Happy to help," came his eager reply. That Saturday, Gordon arrived in a meticulously clean pickup truck, wearing work gloves and carrying a toolbox that appeared to contain every possible tool required. The efficiency with which he loaded the washing machine, transported it, and installed it in my apartment was admittedly impressive. What unsettled me was his attention to my living space, the way his eyes lingered on family photos, how he noted my book collection, the casual opening of cabinets under the premise of looking for connections. "You have a nice place," he commented, his gaze sweeping across my apartment in what felt like memorization. "Very secure building, too, good locks." When the installation was complete, I attempted to pay him for his time and effort. "Please, let me give you something for all this work." Gordon shook his head firmly. "I don't want your money." "Then at least let me buy you lunch or something," I insisted, uncomfortable with the imbalance of obligation. His expression shifted subtly. "Actually, there is something." He maintained casual eye contact that felt anything but casual. "There's this trail I know, not far from here. Great views. Maybe we could hike it sometime? This weekend, perhaps?" The request hung in the air, seemingly innocent yet loaded with implication. My instinct screamed to decline. But the weight of social obligation, he had just spent 3 hours helping me, made outright rejection difficult. "I suppose that would work," I heard myself agreeing. "Just a short hike, though. I have plans later in the day." Gordon's face transformed with genuine pleasure. "Great, I'll pick you up Sunday at 9. After he left, I immediately called Jade. I just agreed to go hiking with Gordon. "Oh," she paused. "That's new. He's never asked me to do anything social." "Should I be worried?" I asked directly. "No," she answered, though her hesitation was noticeable. "He's odd but harmless. Just maybe keep your location shared with me." That night, I researched the trail Gordon had mentioned, Oak Ridge Trail, a popular local hiking spot with well-traveled paths and regular ranger patrols. This knowledge provided some comfort, but anxiety still crept through my dreams, manifesting as visions of forests and watching eyes. Sunday morning arrived with perfect autumn clarity, crisp air, golden sunlight, and a sky so intensely blue it seemed artificially enhanced. Under different circumstances, it would have been an ideal day for hiking. Gordon arrived precisely at 9, his truck freshly washed, wearing hiking boots that appeared brand new. He had brought water bottles, trail mix, and a first aid kit, all presented with a shopkeeper's pride. "Safety first," he said, indicating the kit. "Never know what might happen on a trail." The drive to Oak Ridge was filled with Gordon's monologue about local history, plant identification, and hiking safety, information delivered with the rehearsed quality of a tour guide. I contributed occasional acknowledgments while sharing my location with both Jade and my sister. The trailhead parking lot contained several other vehicles, a reassuring sign of other hikers. Gordon seemed slightly disappointed by this. "It's busier than usual," he remarked. "We might want to take one of the less traveled paths to get the full experience." "I prefer staying on the main trail," I countered firmly, "especially since I'm not familiar with this area." He acquiesced with a tight smile, and we began our hike on the well-marked main path. For the first mile, everything progressed normally. Gordon maintained a respectful distance, pointed out interesting plants, and shared genuinely engaging facts about local wildlife. The tension in my shoulders began to ease slightly as we passed other hiking groups. Then we reached a fork in the trail. "The main path continues that way," Gordon indicated the wider, clearly maintained route. "But there's something really special down this side trail, something not many people get to see." The smaller path veered sharply downhill, disappearing into denser forest. No other hikers were visible in that direction. "What's down there?" I asked, remaining firmly in place. It's hard to explain, Gordon replied, his voice taking on an unusual intensity. It's something I discovered a few weeks ago, something remarkable. I've been waiting for the right person to share it with. Alarm bells screamed in my mind as Gordon stepped closer, his expression shifting into something I hadn't seen before. An almost childlike excitement tinged with something darker. It's not far, he continued, already moving toward the side path. Just 5 minutes. You'll never forget it, I promise. Making a split-second decision I would later recognize as profoundly unwise, I followed, partially from curiosity, partially from the social pressure of not wanting to seem unreasonable, and partially from the false security of knowing others were nearby on the main trail. The side path descended steeply, forcing us to navigate exposed roots and slippery leaves. The sunlight diminished as the tree canopy thickened overhead, temperature dropping noticeably. Gordon moved with unexpected agility, frequently looking back to ensure I was following. After several minutes, longer than the promised 5, Gordon stopped abruptly. We're almost there, he whispered, though there was no apparent reason for lowered voices. Just through these trees. He pushed aside a branch, revealing a small clearing surrounded by dense undergrowth. My heart rate accelerated as I stepped forward, unsure what I expected to find. What awaited would permanently alter the trajectory of my life. The clearing was unremarkable at first glance, a depression in the forest floor scattered with fallen leaves and broken branches. Then the smell registered, a heavy, sickly sweet odor that caught in my throat and triggered an instinctive recoil. Gordon stood motionless, watching me intently. Do you see it? I didn't want to look where he was indicating, but my eyes followed his gesture to a disturbed area of ground partially concealed by gathered branches and leaves. Through the deliberate camouflage, I could distinguish the unmistakable shape of a human form. The body lay face up, partially buried but clearly visible, a man in his 40s, dressed in hiking clothes now discolored and degraded. Natural decomposition had begun its inexorable process, the face distorted but still recognizably human. Various insects moved purposefully across the exposed skin. My body responded before my mind could process, stepping backward, breathing quickening, fingernails digging into my palms. Isn't it fascinating? Gordon's voice had transformed, carrying a reverent quality that chilled me more than the sight itself. I found him 3 weeks ago. No one else knows he's here. Horror compounded as the implications clarified. Gordon had discovered a dead body in the woods and chosen to keep it secret, to preserve it as a macabre exhibit to share with select viewers. We need to call the police, I managed, voice barely cooperating. Gordon continued as if I hadn't spoken. At first the smell was overwhelming, but it's better now. I've been documenting the changes. Nature's recycling process is remarkably efficient. The casualness of his tone, discussing human decomposition as one might describe a science experiment, triggered a surge of adrenaline. My survival instincts finally overcame social conditioning. I think I'm going to be sick, I gasped, turning away. I need to get back to the main trail. Gordon stepped closer, his expression showing not concern but disappointment. We just got here. Don't you want to look closer? The way the insects have specialized is truly remarkable. No, I said firmly, already moving backward. I need air. We need to report this immediately. As I retreated up the path, Gordon followed reluctantly. Most people don't understand, he called after me. They're disconnected from the reality of death. This is natural. Beautiful, even. I increased my pace, desperate to reach other hikers. The isolation of the side trail now felt suffocating. The distance back to safety impossibly long. Gordon kept pace easily, continuing his disturbing commentary. When we finally emerged onto the main trail, I spotted an older couple approaching. With forced casualness that took tremendous effort, I called out to them, "Excuse me, could you point us toward the trailhead? I think we took a wrong turn." The man consulted a trail map. "You're heading the right way, but it's about 2 miles back." "Would you mind if we walked with you?" I asked, ignoring Gordon's frown. "I'm feeling a bit lightheaded." The couple agreed readily, and I positioned myself between them and Gordon, ensuring I wouldn't be left alone with him again. The mile-long walk back felt interminable, my mind racing between processing what I'd seen and planning my next actions. As we approached the parking area, I pulled out my phone and pretended to receive a call. "Hi, Jade," I said to the silent phone. "Yes, I'm still with Gordon. We're just finishing our hike. I'll have him drop me at your place in about 20 minutes, okay?" Gordon watched this performance with narrowed eyes but said nothing. Inside Gordon's truck, silence hung heavily as we pulled away from the trailhead. My heart hammered against my ribs as I gripped my phone tightly, ready to call emergency services at the first sign of danger. "You didn't enjoy our discovery," Gordon finally said, his tone suggesting genuine bewilderment. "Gordon, that was a dead person," I stated firmly. "Someone who should be reported to authorities and returned to their family." He shrugged slightly. "Death is part of life. Most people hide from it, but I find that dishonest." "Did you—" I hesitated, uncertain how to phrase my suspicion. "How did you first find the body?" "Hiking," he answered simply. "Same trail, about 3 weeks ago. I was exploring off-path and there he was." I studied his profile, searching for tells of deception. "And you didn't report it because—" "Reports mean paperwork, questions, interruptions to the natural process." His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "People fear what they don't understand." While his explanation left critical questions unanswered, his attention remained fortunately focused on driving. I texted Jade under the guise of checking my notifications. "Emergency. Gordon showed me a dead body in the woods, not joking. Coming to your place. Call police after we arrive." Her response was immediate. "What? Are you safe? Should I call now?" "Wait until I'm there. Don't want him to run. Act normal when we arrive." The 20-minute drive stretched into eternity. I maintained superficial conversation while mentally cataloging every detail I could remember about the body and location to report to police. When we finally reached Jade's apartment, she was waiting outside, her casual pose betrayed by the tension visible in her shoulders. "Thanks for the ride," I told Gordon, exiting quickly. "And the hike." "We should do it again," he suggested, seeming genuinely oblivious to the horror of the situation. "There's more to see on other trails." "Sure," I lied. "Text me." Jade and I watched him drive away before rushing inside. The moment her door closed, I collapsed against it, trembling uncontrollably. "Tell me everything," she demanded. Between gasping breaths, I recounted the discovery. Jade called the police immediately, her voice steady despite her pallor. Within 30 minutes, 2 detectives sat in Jade's living room as I detailed my experience. They listened with professional detachment, occasionally interjecting with clarifying questions. "And you're certain the individual was deceased?" one asked. "Not injured?" "Absolutely certain," I confirmed. "Decomposition was advanced." They asked about Gordon, his full name, address, how we knew him, his behavior before and after showing me the body. I described his disturbing fascination and lack of appropriate emotional response. "We'll need you to guide officers to the location," the detective explained. "Can you do that tomorrow morning?" I nodded, despite the revulsion at the thought of returning. After they left, Jade and I sat in stunned silence before she finally spoke. "I never thought he was strange, but this... We need to cut him out completely," I insisted. "Block his number, his social media, everything." "What if he retaliates?" she whispered. "He knows where we both live." The realization that Gordon now presented an active threat rather than merely an unsettling presence settled over us like a shroud. "We need a plan," I said, "a careful exit strategy." The following weeks unfolded in a blur of police statements, nightmares, and constant vigilance. I led officers to the body, which was recovered and later identified as a 45-year-old hiker who had been reported missing a month earlier. Cause of death was determined to be a cardiac event, a natural death that Gordon had transformed into something macabre through his actions. Gordon himself remained disturbingly present in our periphery. His messages continued as if nothing had happened, though we responded with increasing brevity. Police questioned him extensively about his failure to report finding the body, but without evidence of foul play in the hiker's death, they could only charge him with relatively minor offenses related to interfering with a death scene. Our exit strategy from Gordon's life proceeded with excruciating slowness. We feared that an abrupt disconnection might trigger escalation, so instead, we implemented a deliberate fade, delayed responses, claims of busyness, gradual unavailability. Gordon seemed to sense the withdrawal. His messages increased in frequency, even as our responses decreased. He appeared unexpectedly outside Jade's workplace one afternoon, just to say hello, and left packages of unrequested groceries at our doors. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when Jade began dating someone. When she mentioned her new relationship in our group chat, Gordon's messages suddenly ceased entirely. The silence was both relieving and unnerving. 3 months after the hiking incident, police arrested a man in connection with another death, a homicide that had occurred in the same forest region. Through social media investigation, they discovered this man had connections to Gordon. They followed each other on several platforms and had exchanged messages. While Gordon was never charged with direct involvement in any homicide, the investigation revealed disturbing patterns in his behavior. Documented fascination with death scenes, extensive photography of roadkill and dead animals, and journal entries detailing his observations of decomposition processes. Psychological evaluation concluded he suffered from a complex combination of conditions that manifested in his inappropriate responses to death and human remains, along with his patterns of intrusive behavior and social misconduct. Today, 5 years later, I still avoid hiking trails. The rustle of leaves in wooded areas triggers immediate anxiety. Jade has moved to another state, partly motivated by putting distance between herself and the memories of Gordon. The last we heard, Gordon had been institutionalized after an incident involving cemetery desecration. While his direct connection to any murder remains unproven, his relationship with death continues to exist outside normal human boundaries. What stays with me most isn't the disturbing image of the body in the woods, though that appears often enough in dreams. Rather, it's the memory of Gordon's expression as he showed me his discovery. The genuine incomprehension that I didn't share his fascination, the complete disconnect from normal human emotion. In the years since, I've come to understand that the most terrifying monsters aren't supernatural creatures lurking in shadows. They're the people walking among us whose internal landscape is so fundamentally different from our own that connection becomes impossible. People who look human but operate by unfathomable rules. I keep my doors doubly locked now. I verify the identity of delivery people through peepholes. I no longer give out my phone number casually, and I've become selective about which social media platforms I use. Most importantly, I've learned to trust that flutter of unease when something feels wrong about a person or situation. That sensation exists for a reason, an evolutionary warning system honed over millennia of human experience. When someone shows you who they are, especially in small, unsettling ways, believe them the first time. Your survival may depend on it. Our town of Pinecrest sat on the edge of what locals called the North Woods, not because it was particularly northern, but because it stretched along the north side of our rural community. Houses were scattered across several acres each, with thick patches of forest serving as natural privacy barriers between properties. Growing up here meant learning to navigate these wooded areas as shortcuts between friends' homes. I was 15 that autumn, a sophomore at Pinecrest High, while my sister Catherine, Kate to everyone who knew her, was 17 and already planning her escape to college. Our parents, Robert and Ann Winters, were typical suburban professionals. Dad worked as an engineer for the local manufacturing plant, and Mom taught history at my high school. We lived in a modest 2-story colonial at the end of a winding cul-de-sac on Spruce Lane. On weekends, Kate and I often visited our friend Eleanor, Ellie, who lived about a mile away. Her house sat on the other side of a particularly dense stretch of woods, but we knew the path well. During daylight hours, the walk was pleasant, with dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. After dark, however, the forest transformed into something altogether different. Our parents insisted on driving us if we stayed past sunset, a rule we rarely questioned. The woods were home to the occasional coyote, and the path could be treacherous in the dark. But teenagers, as they do, occasionally bend parental rules when circumstances allow. Friday, October 12th began like any other autumn day. The morning air carried a crisp chill, and leaves in vibrant shades of crimson and amber carpeted the ground. I remember watching the weather forecast before school, noting the newscaster's mention of the new moon that night. "Stargazers will be disappointed," she'd said, "as the sky will be particularly dark without lunar illumination." I hadn't given it much thought then. Why would I? It was just another Friday with plans to watch movies at Ellie's after school. Mom had reminded us at breakfast that she and Dad would be attending a dinner party with colleagues that evening. "We'll be at the Brewsters until around 11, she'd said, pouring coffee into her travel mug. "Call if you need a ride home from Ellie's. Don't walk back in the dark." Kate and I had nodded, barely looking up from our phones. A typical morning exchange, forgettable in every way. That evening, we walked to Ellie's house just before sunset, enjoying the last warm rays of October sun. The dinner at Ellie's was pizza and sodas, followed by a marathon of horror movies, the irony of which wouldn't escape me later. We lost track of time, engrossed in the fictional terror playing out on the screen, completely unaware of what awaited us outside. When Ellie's mother glanced at her watch and announced it was nearly 10 p.m., Kate and I exchanged looks of concern. We hadn't planned to stay so late. "Should we call Mom and Dad?" I asked. Kate checked her phone. "They're still at the Brewster's party. I don't want to bother them. Besides, we've walked the path 100 times. "Not on a new moon night," Ellie pointed out. Kate shrugged. "We have our phone flashlights. It's only a mile." This casual decision, this small moment of teenage hubris, would alter everything that followed. We said goodbye to Ellie, declining her mother's offer to drive us. "It's not that late," Kate insisted. "We'll be fine." The temperature had dropped considerably since our arrival. Our light jackets provided minimal protection against the autumn chill as we started down Ellie's long driveway. Our breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the darkness. The entrance to the forest path stood before us like a black curtain. Kate turned on her phone flashlight and I followed suit. The beams cut thin corridors through the darkness but illuminated barely 10 feet ahead. The trees, stripped of leaves, created a lattice of skeletal branches above us, blocking what little starlight might have guided our way. "Stay close," Kate said, her voice already lower than normal. The forest floor was damp from an earlier drizzle, muffling our footsteps as we ventured deeper into the woods. Fallen leaves made the path slippery in places. The familiar route suddenly seemed alien in the profound darkness. We had traveled perhaps half the distance, reaching the densest part of the forest when Kate stopped abruptly. I nearly collided with her back. "What's wrong?" I whispered. "Listen," she said, her voice barely audible. I held my breath, straining to hear whatever had caught her attention. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then I heard it, a raspy inhalation followed by a wheezing exhale. The sound came from somewhere behind us. "Probably just a raccoon or something," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. Kate didn't respond, but her posture had changed. Her shoulders tensed and she gripped her phone tighter. We resumed walking, our pace noticeably quicker. The path narrowed, forcing us into single file. Kate led the way, while I took the rear position. With each step, my awareness of the breathing behind us intensified. It maintained a steady distance, not advancing but never receding either. Then came the footsteps. Unlike the scurrying of forest animals or the 4-beat rhythm of deer, these steps had a distinctly bipedal cadence. Step, drag, step, drag. As if one leg wasn't functioning properly. My heart hammered against my ribs. Kate must have heard it too because her pace increased again. "Don't run," I whispered. "Not yet." I turned, sweeping my flashlight in a wide arc behind us. For a fraction of a second, the beam caught something approximately 30 yards back. The figure stood upright, impossibly thin. What struck me most was its skeletal appearance, not the thinness of malnutrition, but a wrongness in its proportions. Its head appeared elongated, with what looked like a canine-shaped snout and pointed ears. The skin or surface of the figure seemed hairless, with a texture I couldn't identify at that distance. Before I could focus, the figure stepped sideways into the darkness between trees, vanishing from the flashlight's beam. "Kate," I hissed, grabbing her jacket. "There's something following us." She turned, aiming her light where mine had been. "I don't see anything." "It moved, but it's there. I saw it." The breathing continued, now accompanied by a faint clicking sound like nails or claws tapping against tree bark. "We need to run," Kate said, no longer bothering to keep her voice down. We broke into a sprint, abandoning all pretense of calm. The path ahead twisted through the trees, roots threatening to trip us with every step. Our house lay approximately a quarter-mile ahead, just beyond the forest's edge. Behind us, the breathing grew louder. The irregular footsteps accelerated into a consistent rhythm. Step, 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 step. Whatever pursued us was no longer dragging its leg. We burst from the tree line onto our street, gasping for air. The sudden transition from forest to suburb should have felt like safety, but the street was deserted. No cars passed by, no neighbors were visible in their yards or windows, just empty pavement illuminated by widely spaced streetlights. Our house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, porch light glowing like a beacon. We sprinted up the long driveway, our legs burning with exertion. Kate reached the front door first, yanking frantically at the handle. "It's locked," she cried. "Your keys," I reminded her between gasps. "You have your keys." As she fumbled in her pocket, I turned to look behind us. For a moment, the street appeared empty. Then I spotted it, a figure crouched at the edge of our driveway, partially concealed by our neighbor's hedge. In the ambient light from nearby houses, its outline was clearer than before. The thinness I'd noticed was even more pronounced. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, and its head remained disproportionately elongated. Most disturbing was the awareness that it was watching us. I could still hear its labored breathing from 30 yards away. "Kate," I whispered without turning. "It's right there." The jingling of keys seemed to last an eternity before she finally pushed the door open. We tumbled inside, slamming and locking the door behind us. For several minutes, we stood in the foyer, catching our breath, afraid to move or speak. Finally, Kate approached the living room window, carefully pulling aside the curtain to peer outside. I joined her, searching for the crouched figure by the hedge. It was gone. Our parents returned from their dinner party an hour later, finding Kate and me still awake, huddled together on the living room couch with all the lights on. "You're both still up?" Mom asked, setting her purse on the entry table. "I thought you'd be at Ellie's." "We walked home," Kate said, her voice steadier than I expected. Dad frowned, hanging his coat in the closet. "In the dark? You know the rule about that." "We didn't want to bother you," I explained. Something in our expressions must have revealed our distress because Mom's demeanor shifted immediately. She sat beside us on the couch. "What happened?" We told them everything. The walk through the woods, the breathing sounds, the figure I'd glimpsed with my flashlight, and its appearance at the edge of our driveway. We described its skeletal thinness, its elongated head, the unnatural angles of its limbs. With each detail, Dad's expression grew more skeptical while Mom's became increasingly concerned. "You probably saw a deer," Dad suggested. "They can look strange when they stand on their hind legs to reach branches." "It wasn't a deer," Kate insisted. "It followed us the entire way." "Or maybe a large coyote," he continued. "They've been spotted in the area." "Coyotes don't walk on two legs," I said. Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "What exactly are you suggesting you saw?" Neither of us had an answer. We couldn't name what had followed us because it matched nothing in our experience. "Whatever it was," Mom interjected, "you're both safe now, but no more walking after dark, understood? Not even if it means calling us away from a dinner party." Dad stood, moving toward the window. "I'll take a look around outside. Make sure there's nothing lurking about." "Robert, don't," Mom protested. If some vagrant is prowling around our property, I want to know about it, he replied, already retrieving the baseball bat he kept near the back door. We watched through the window as Dad circled the house, flashlight in one hand and bat in the other. He checked the perimeter, investigating the hedges where I'd seen the figure crouching. Finding nothing, he returned inside, locking the door behind him. All clear, he announced. Nothing but raccoons in the Johnson's trash cans. You girls probably saw an animal, and your imagination did the rest. It happens in the dark. We didn't argue, but neither Kate nor I believed his explanation. What we'd seen wasn't a product of overactive imagination. The systematic way it had pursued us, the calculated manner in which it had hidden at the edge of our property, these weren't animal behaviors, at least not from any animal native to our region. Sleep came reluctantly that night. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the house settling and the occasional rustling of branches against my window. Each noise made me tense with anticipation, wondering if the thing had returned. When exhaustion finally claimed me, my dreams were filled with emaciated figures running through endless forests. The following night brought a false sense of normalcy. We ate dinner as a family, watching a game show on television afterward. By midnight, everyone had retired to their respective bedrooms. I had almost convinced myself that the previous night's events were exaggerated by fear and darkness. Almost, but not entirely. Around 12:30 a.m., I heard Dad's heavy footsteps in the hallway. Our house had a strict waste management system, primarily enforced by Mom, who couldn't tolerate the smell of garbage overnight. Dad's responsibility included taking out the trash before bed, regardless of the hour. I listened as he descended the stairs. The back door opened with its distinctive creak, followed by the sound of the screen door tapping against its frame. Normal sounds, familiar sounds. Then came the scream, short, abrupt, more surprised than pained. A heavy thud followed, as if something had struck the side of the house with considerable force. "Let me in," Dad's voice called from the back porch. "Open the door." Fear paralyzed me momentarily before I threw off my covers and raced into the hallway. Kate emerged from her room simultaneously, eyes wide with alarm. We hurried downstairs together, reaching the kitchen just as Mom descended behind us. Dad practically fell through the doorway when we opened it. His face was ashen, contorted in a mixture of shock and pain. The right leg of his pajama pants was torn, revealing several puncture wounds on his ankle. Blood seeped from the injuries, staining the kitchen tile. "What happened?" Mom gasped, helping him to a chair. "Something bit me," he said between labored breaths. "It was hiding beside the trash cans. I didn't see it at first." Kate retrieved the first aid kit from beneath the sink while Mom examined the wound. The punctures formed a semicircle pattern consistent with a bite, but the configuration didn't match typical dog or coyote dentition. The spacing was too narrow, the individual wounds too deep. "What did it look like?" I asked, already certain of the answer. Dad's hands trembled slightly as Mom cleaned the punctures with antiseptic. "I didn't get a good look at first. It was low to the ground like it was crouching. When it bit me, I yelled and kicked at it. That's when it stood up." He paused, seemingly reluctant to continue. "It stood up?" Kate prompted. Dad nodded. "On two legs. The thing was at least a foot taller than me when it stood upright. Its arms were too long and its face..." He trailed off, shaking his head. I didn't see it clearly. It all happened so fast. "We need to call the police," Mom insisted, reaching for her phone. "And tell them what?" Dad countered. "That an unidentifiable creature bit me and disappeared into the night? They'll think I'm intoxicated or hallucinating." "Then the hospital," Mom insisted. "Those punctures are deep. You need antibiotics, possibly rabies prophylaxis." Dad didn't argue against medical attention. Within 20 minutes, Mom had helped him to the car, instructing Kate and me to lock all doors and windows and to call immediately if anything unusual occurred. They returned from the emergency room 4 hours later. Dad had received a tetanus booster, antibiotics, and the first in a series of rabies shots. The attending physician had documented the incident as a wild animal attack, species undetermined. I told them it was a stray dog, Dad explained as he settled onto the couch, his bandaged ankle elevated on a pillow. Anything else would have raised too many questions. Mom appeared exhausted, dark circles forming beneath her eyes. The doctor said the bite pattern was unusual, not typical of canines in this region. What else could it be? Kate asked. No one offered an answer. The following days brought changes to our household routine. Dad installed motion sensor lights around the property's perimeter. He purchased a more sophisticated security system with cameras monitoring all entry points. The new family rule became absolute. No one went outside after sunset under any circumstances. Dad's wounds healed without infection, though he walked with a slight limp for several weeks afterward. The physical recovery progressed well, but something fundamental had changed in him. The skeptic who had dismissed our encounter now jumped at unexpected noises. He checked and rechecked door locks before bed. He purchased a firearm, something he had previously opposed on principle, and kept it secured in a bedside safe. Mom researched local wildlife, consulting with forestry services about unusual animal sightings in the area. The reports mentioned nothing resembling what we had encountered. Kate and I no longer walked to Ellie's house, even during daylight hours. When friends asked why, we manufactured excuses about busy schedules and family obligations. How could we explain what had happened? Who would believe us? School continued. Homework was completed. Meals were prepared and consumed. From the outside, the Winters family appeared normal, if perhaps more security conscious than before. But within our home, conversation often faltered when the subject of that night arose. One evening, approximately 2 weeks after Dad's encounter, I noticed him staring through the living room window, his attention fixed on the forest edge beyond our property line. "Do you think it's still out there?" I asked, joining him at the window. He didn't look away from the darkening tree line. "I don't know, but something is." "What do you mean?" Dad hesitated before responding. "The motion lights have been triggering almost nightly, usually around 3 in the morning. The cameras don't catch anything, just shadows that could be branches moving in the wind." "Have you told Mom?" No need to worry her more than necessary. He turned to face me directly. "But I need you to promise me something. If you ever see it again, inside or outside this house, you run. Don't try to confront it. Don't try to understand it. Just run." The seriousness in his expression frightened me more than his words. My father, the pragmatic engineer who believed every problem had a logical solution, was advising flight over understanding. "What is it, Dad? What do you think that thing is?" He shook his head slowly. "I've spent my life believing that nature operates according to established principles. That unexplained phenomena simply lacks sufficient investigation." He paused, returning his gaze to the window. "I'm no longer certain of that." Winter arrived with early snowfall in November. The forest transformed, bare branches now carrying burdens of white. School canceled for 2 consecutive days due to treacherous road conditions. Our house felt like an island in a sea of unmarked snow. The isolation should have been comforting. Whatever had stalked us would surely leave tracks in the pristine whiteness surrounding our property. Yet the motion sensor lights continued to activate during early morning hours, sometimes triggering in sequence as if something were circling the house. On the 3rd night of snowfall, I woke to a scratching sound at my bedroom window. My room was on the 2nd floor, with no trees close enough for branches to reach the glass. The scratching continued, deliberate, rhythmic. 3 scrapes followed by a pause, then repeated. I remained motionless in bed, scarcely breathing as I stared at the curtained window. The digital clock on my nightstand displayed 3:17 a.m. Outside, one of the motion sensor lights activated, casting shadows across my ceiling. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a now familiar sound. Raspy inhalation. Wheezing exhalation. Something was breathing just outside my window, 20 feet above the ground. Moving as silently as possible, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The scratching resumed, more insistent than before. I typed a text message to Kate, whose bedroom was across the hall. "Something at my window. Don't turn on lights. Get Dad." The response came within seconds. on it. Minutes passed like hours as I lay paralyzed in bed, watching the window. The curtain moved slightly, as if disturbed by air currents from outside, but the window was closed. Something was manipulating the fabric from the other side of the glass. A corner of the curtain lifted, revealing a sliver of the night beyond. A long, thin appendage, neither clearly a finger nor a claw, had hooked the fabric's edge. The digit appeared jointed in too many places, its surface smooth and grayish in the dim light. The hallway outside my room suddenly flooded with light as Dad emerged from the master bedroom. The appendage withdrew instantly, releasing the curtain. Heavy footsteps approached my door, followed by Dad's voice calling my name. I didn't respond immediately, still watching the window. The breathing sound had ceased, but I couldn't shake the certainty that whatever had been there remained just out of sight. My bedroom door opened, revealing Dad with his newly purchased firearm in hand. Kate stood behind him, face pale with worry. "It was at the window," I whispered, pointing toward the curtain. "It was trying to look inside." Dad approached the window cautiously, using the barrel of the gun to separate the curtains. He peered outside, scanning the darkness before turning back to me. "There's nothing there now," he said, "but there are marks on the siding." He didn't elaborate on what kind of marks, and I didn't ask. We spent the remainder of the night in the living room, lights illuminating every corner. No one suggested returning to bed. No one mentioned calling authorities. We had crossed some threshold of understanding. This was our burden to bear alone because no one else would comprehend what we faced. When daylight finally arrived, Dad ventured outside to examine the exterior wall beneath my window. He returned with photographs on his phone, 4 parallel grooves cut into the vinyl siding, approximately 6 feet in length, leading up to my window. The marks didn't resemble claw scrapes or tool marks. They appeared almost deliberate, like a message inscribed in a language we couldn't decipher. That afternoon, Dad installed metal security grates over every window in the house. Mom didn't object to the expense or the prison-like appearance they created. None of us objected. We understood the necessity. Spring arrived, melting snow and revealing the dormant landscape beneath. 5 months had passed since our initial encounter. The scratching at my window hadn't repeated, though the motion sensors still occasionally activated without apparent cause. I had begun researching similar incidents, spending hours in the school library and online, searching for patterns that might explain what we had experienced. Kate, preparing for college in the fall, assisted when her schedule permitted. We compiled reports of unusual sightings, unexplained animal attacks, and aberrant wildlife behavior within a 100-mile radius of our town. Most accounts proved mundane upon closer examination: misidentified known animals, optical illusions created by lighting conditions, or outright fabrications. But a handful of reports contained details that resonated with our experience. A hiker in the national forest 30 miles north had photographed unusual tracks in mud, bipedal but with an asymmetrical gait suggesting one leg differed from the other. A farmer reported livestock injuries with bite patterns inconsistent with recognized predators. 3 separate accounts described unusually tall, thin figures observed at forest edges during twilight hours. None provided definitive evidence, but collectively, they suggested we weren't alone in our experience. Whatever had followed us home that night had encountered others before and since. I compiled my findings in a journal, documenting dates, locations, and commonalities between reports. A pattern emerged. Sightings clustered along waterways and concentrated in areas where suburban development encroached upon old-growth forest. Our neighborhood, built 20 years earlier in what had once been continuous woodland, fit the profile perfectly. During a weekend exploration of the woods between our house and Ellie's, conducted in daylight and with Dad's reluctant permission, Kate and I discovered something unexpected. In a small clearing approximately halfway along the path, we found a crude structure assembled from fallen branches and strips of bark. The construction resembled a shelter or blind, positioned to provide a view of the path while remaining concealed by surrounding vegetation. "Someone built this," Kate said, examining the interwoven branches. "Recently." The implications disturbed us both. Either a person had constructed this observation post, suggesting human involvement in what we had experienced, or the thing itself possessed intelligence and purpose beyond animal instinct. We photographed the structure before continuing our investigation. Deeper in the woods, approximately 50 yards from the main path, we discovered a small cave entrance partially concealed by boulders. The opening was narrow, perhaps 3 feet in height and 2 feet wide, but darkness prevented us from seeing how far the cavity extended. A peculiar odor emanated from the opening, not the expected earthiness of a natural cave, but something sharper, more acrid. It reminded me of a chemistry lab with undertones of decay. "We should come back with flashlights," Kate suggested. I disagreed emphatically. "We shouldn't come back at all." We marked the location on a map before returning home, sharing our discoveries with our parents. Dad's reaction surprised us both. Rather than dismissing our findings or cautioning against further exploration, he immediately contacted a friend who worked for the state environmental agency. 2 days later, Dad's friend arrived with equipment to inspect the cave. We watched from a distance as he donned protective gear before entering the narrow opening. He emerged 30 minutes later, his expression unreadable behind his respirator mask. The official report, delivered a week later, described the cave as unremarkable, a natural formation approximately 12 feet deep, with no signs of animal habitation or human activity. Air samples revealed elevated levels of methane and sulfur compounds consistent with organic decomposition, explaining the unusual odor. Dad's friend pulled him aside before departing, a conversation we weren't meant to overhear but did anyway. "There's something else," he said quietly. "The interior walls show signs of modification, tool marks. Someone has been enlarging that space deliberately." The shelter Kate and I discovered disappeared 3 days later. Whether removed by park services, destroyed by weather, or dismantled by whoever or whatever had constructed it remained unclear. Summer arrived with increased daylight hours and reduced anxiety. The motion sensors triggered less frequently. Dad's hypervigilance eased somewhat, though our family rule regarding nighttime outings remained strictly enforced. Kate prepared for her departure to college in August. I helped her pack, sorting through childhood mementos and deciding what deserved space in her dormitory room. During this process, we discussed the events of the past year with a frankness we had previously avoided. "Do you think it's gone?" I asked, folding a sweater to place in her suitcase. She considered the question thoughtfully. "I don't think it was ever really here, not completely. It exists at the periphery, where civilization meets wilderness, where light meets darkness." "That's not very scientific," I noted. Kate smiled sadly. "Not everything can be explained through scientific methodology. Some experiences defy categorization. But we both saw it. Dad saw it too. It physically injured him." "I'm not saying it wasn't real," she clarified. "I'm saying its reality might operate according to principles we don't understand." The conversation drifted to lighter topics, but Kate's perspective lingered in my thoughts. Perhaps we had encountered something that existed in the interstices of our reality. Not supernatural, but natural, in a way human experience rarely intersects. The night before Kate departed for college, our parents hosted a small gathering of family friends. During dinner, conversations flowed easily around topics of weather, politics, and community events. No one mentioned strange encounters or unexplained phenomena. As twilight descended, guests moved to the back patio to enjoy the mild evening air. I remained inside, observing through the sliding glass door as Dad recounted an amusing work anecdote. The normality of the scene struck me as surreal after months of heightened awareness and fear. Movement at the forest edge caught my attention, a subtle displacement of shadows beneath the trees. I watched, pulse quickening, as a figure gradually resolved from the darkness. It stood upright, impossibly thin, partially concealed behind a large oak tree. Even at this distance, I could discern its elongated head and the unnatural angles of its limbs. It observed our gathering with what felt like calculated interest, not predatory, not threatening, but coolly analytical. When it sensed my attention, Its gaze shifted toward the house, meeting my eyes through the glass door. Recognition passed between us, a moment of mutual acknowledgement. It had followed us home that night, had injured my father, had scratched at my window. Now it simply observed, as if studying our behavior for some incomprehensible purpose. I should have alerted the others. I should have pointed and screamed and drawn everyone's attention to the creature lurking at the forest's edge. Instead, I maintained its gaze until it deliberately stepped backward, melting into the deepening shadows. Kate found me still staring at the empty tree line minutes later. "Everything okay?" she asked. "It's still here," I replied quietly. "It's always been here." She followed my gaze but saw nothing unusual. "What should we do?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "Nothing. We live with the awareness. We stay vigilant. We acknowledge that our understanding of the world is incomplete." Kate nodded slowly. "And we don't walk in the woods after dark." "Especially that," I agreed. That night, as our household settled into silence, I stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the forest beyond our property. The security grate created a cross-hatched pattern across my view, a constant reminder of what lurked beyond. The motion sensor light activated briefly, illuminating the yard for 30 seconds before darkness returned. In that momentary brightness, I glimpsed a slender figure standing at the property line, motionless, watching, its raspy breathing inaudible through the glass, but familiar nonetheless. I didn't alert the household. I didn't reach for my phone to document the sighting. I simply acknowledged its presence as it acknowledged mine. Whatever evolutionary branch had produced this entity had created something capable of patient observation and calculated interaction. It wasn't merely an animal, yet it wasn't human either. It existed in a classification entirely its own. The light deactivated, returning the yard to darkness. The figure remained, visible now only as a slightly deeper shadow among shadows. I knew it would continue its vigil throughout the night, just as it had for months. I closed my curtains and turned away from the window. Tomorrow, Kate would leave for college. Life would continue with its predictable rhythms and obligations. And in the woods surrounding our home, something would continue watching and waiting, studying our patterns and behaviors for reasons I might never comprehend. Whatever followed us home that night, I remained convinced it's still out there, lying in wait, observing our movements, learning our habits. Not a supernatural entity from folklore or fiction, but something that evolved alongside us, remaining hidden at the boundaries of human experience, watching, waiting, adapting. A reminder that our knowledge of the natural world remains profoundly incomplete. The camping trip had been circled on my calendar for weeks, a small reprieve from the overwhelming demands of adult life. As I packed my gear on that crisp October morning in 2023, I felt the stress of the previous months beginning to dissolve. At 34, these escapes into nature had become increasingly precious, rare opportunities to disconnect and remember what genuinely mattered. Jason, Kevin, and I had planned meticulously, though not extravagantly. Our destination was a remote section of Tennessee wilderness, far from designated campgrounds or hiking trails, the kind of place where cell service disappeared and modern conveniences became distant memories. The three of us had been organizing these excursions since our college days, though our responsibilities had made them increasingly infrequent. "Everything packed?" my wife asked, leaning against the doorframe as I loaded the final supplies into my weathered backpack. "I believe so," I replied, mentally checking off essentials. "Just a simple overnight, tent, sleeping bag, food, and enough beer to ensure good conversation." She smiled, but I noticed the subtle concern in her eyes. "Just be careful out there. The weather forecast mentioned potential storms." I nodded reassuringly. "We'll be fine. Jason checked the radar this morning. Any precipitation should miss us by at least 50 miles. The drive to our meeting point took nearly an hour, winding through progressively narrower roads until civilization seemed to recede in my rearview mirror. Jason's truck was already parked at our designated spot, and Kevin pulled in moments after I arrived. Ready for some proper isolation? Jason grinned as we transferred our gear to his vehicle for the final leg of the journey. His enthusiasm was infectious, always had been since our freshman year roommate days. Kevin, characteristically more reserved, methodically checked his equipment. Map shows the spot about 7 miles up this Forest Service road. Should be perfect. No registered campsites for at least 3 miles in any direction. The implications of that isolation hadn't yet registered as we bounced along the deteriorating dirt road, laughing and recounting stories from previous adventures. The forest grew increasingly dense around us, ancient trees blocking out significant portions of daylight and creating an enclosed corridor that seemed to swallow us whole. None of us recognized the unsettling weight of that seclusion yet. The woods watched our intrusion with patient interest as we drove deeper into their domain, unaware that we were leaving safety far behind us. The Forest Service road eventually deteriorated into little more than a rough trail, forcing Jason to navigate with extreme caution to avoid damaging his vehicle's undercarriage. Massive tree roots had erupted through the soil, creating natural obstacles that required our full attention. The thick canopy above filtered the afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns that shifted eerily across the dashboard. "Should be just ahead," Kevin announced, consulting the GPS coordinates he'd marked before losing signal entirely. "There's supposed to be a small clearing near a seasonal creek." When we finally reached our destination, the area appeared perfect, almost suspiciously so. A natural opening in the dense forest created a roughly circular clearing approximately 30 yards in diameter. The remnants of a fire ring indicated previous human presence, though it appeared long abandoned. "Someone's been here before," I observed, kneeling to examine the old charcoal remains. "But not recently." Jason shrugged, already unloading equipment from the truck. "That's reassuring, actually. Means it's a good spot. Let's set up before we lose more daylight." We fell into our well-established routine. Kevin assembled the tent, Jason gathered firewood, and I unpacked our supplies and prepared the cooking area. The efficiency of long practice had us fully established within an hour. As evening approached, we concentrated on building a substantial fire. October nights in these mountains could drop to near-freezing temperatures. The flames provided welcome warmth as darkness enveloped the forest. We positioned our camp chairs in a semicircle, cracked open our first beers, and settled into the comfortable familiarity of long-established friendship. Stars gradually appeared overhead, more numerous and brilliant than anything visible near the light pollution of our everyday lives. "Remember our first trip out here?" Jason asked, stoking the fire with a long branch. "Senior year, when we got completely lost because Kevin insisted he could navigate without a map?" Kevin laughed, accepting the mockery with good nature. "We were only lost for 3 hours. Besides, we found that abandoned hunter's cabin. That was worth the detour." The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by the crackling fire and occasional distant wildlife sounds. We reminisced about previous adventures, shared updates on career developments, and avoided discussing the increasingly complicated aspects of our adult lives. The isolation felt therapeutic rather than threatening, a deliberate disconnect from responsibilities and expectations. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped significantly. We added the last substantial logs to the fire and retreated to our tent, arranging our sleeping bags in the familiar configuration. The forest had grown strangely quiet, I realized. No owls, no rustling vegetation, no scurrying nocturnal creatures. Just absolute stillness, interrupted only by our own movements. "Unusually quiet tonight," I remarked as we settled in. "Always is this deep in," Jason replied through a yawn. "One of the reasons I love it out here." Within minutes, their breathing had slowed into the rhythm of sleep. I lay awake slightly longer, listening to the profound silence and watching shadowy tree branches create abstract patterns on the tent fabric. When sleep finally claimed me, it was deep and dreamless. Morning arrived with diffused gray light filtering through the tent walls. I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before remembering where we were. Jason and Kevin remained motionless in their sleeping bags, their breathing deep and regular. My watch displayed 6:17 a.m., earlier than I typically rose, but normal during these outdoor excursions when artificial light no longer dictated our schedules. The temperature had dropped considerably overnight. My breath formed visible clouds as I carefully extracted myself from my sleeping bag, trying not to disturb my companions. The fire had reduced to faintly glowing embers, barely radiating any heat. I shivered, pulling on an additional layer before unzipping the tent entrance. Outside, the forest remained wrapped in early morning stillness. A thin layer of ground fog hovered between the trees, creating an ethereal boundary between earth and air. Dew had accumulated on every surface, transforming spider webs into intricate crystal structures between branches. The beauty of it momentarily captured my attention, nature's delicate artistry displayed without human interference. My immediate priority was restarting the fire and preparing coffee. I recalled seeing the coffee pot in Jason's truck the previous evening, so I headed toward the vehicle, my boots leaving distinct impressions in the dew-dampened earth. The truck was parked approximately 20 yards from our tent, partially obscured by a stand of young pine trees. As I approached, something about the vehicle's silhouette seemed wrong, different from how we'd left it. At first, I thought perhaps an animal had disturbed our supplies, but the modification appeared too deliberate, too intentional. Drawing closer, confusion transformed into horrified comprehension. Stretched meticulously across the hood of Jason's truck was what appeared to be an animal skin, completely flattened and displayed with unmistakable purposefulness. The fur had been methodically removed, leaving only the inner dermal layer exposed, raw, pink, and glistening with moisture. Dark crimson streaks extended down the windshield in precisely parallel lines, some still wet enough to reflect the gray morning light. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. The skin had been positioned with careful deliberation, centered perfectly on the hood, corners aligned with the vehicle's edges. This wasn't random animal activity or a natural occurrence. This was a message created by human hands with frightening precision. The skin itself proved difficult to identify. The proportions suggested deer, but the absence of the head and limbs, evidently removed with crude cutting implements, obscured definitive identification. What remained was approximately 4 feet in length and nearly as wide, fastidiously stretched to maximize surface area. The edges appeared jagged and irregular, suggesting hurried or inexperienced butchery. The odor registered next, a powerful, nauseating combination of raw meat, copper-scented blood, and something more troubling beneath those expected smells, a sickly sweet note of early decomposition. The stench triggered an involuntary gag reflex that I struggled to suppress. Instinctively, I scanned the surrounding forest, suddenly acutely aware of our vulnerability. The trees stood as impassive witnesses, revealing nothing. No movement caught my eye, no sound betrayed another presence, yet the undeniable evidence of human activity during the night transformed the previously benign wilderness into something immediately threatening. I needed to wake Jason and Kevin. We needed to leave. "Jason! Kevin!" I called urgently, retreating backward toward the tent while maintaining visual contact with the surrounding forest. "You need to see this." The desperation in my voice achieved the desired effect. Within seconds, the tent rustled with movement, followed by Jason's sleepy voice. "What's happening?" "Just get out here," I insisted, unwilling to articulate what I'd discovered. They emerged moments later, initially confused and irritated at the abrupt awakening. Kevin rubbed his eyes, squinting against the morning light. "What's got you so?" His words terminated abruptly as he followed my gaze to the truck. Jason emerged behind him, his expression transitioning from annoyance to shock as comprehension dawned. "What the actual—" Jason approached cautiously, as though the displayed skin might somehow animate. "Is that—" "Some kind of animal skin," I confirmed, "deliberately placed during the night." Kevin remained frozen, his complexion visibly paling. Someone was here while we slept. The statement hung between us, weighted with implications none of us wanted to confront. A subtle snap of a twig from somewhere within the forest perimeter accelerated our decision-making process. Without verbal agreement, we began dismantling our campsite with unprecedented efficiency. The tent collapsed haphazardly into its storage bag, cooking equipment clattered into containers without being cleaned. Sleeping bags were stuffed rather than rolled. What about that? Kevin nodded toward the skin still adorning the truck's hood. Jason retrieved a fallen branch from nearby, using it to push the grotesque display off his vehicle. It slid reluctantly, leaving smeared trails of blood and tissue before landing on the ground with a disturbingly substantial sound. None of us looked at it directly again. Within 12 minutes, a new record for decamping, we had loaded everything into the truck. Jason started the engine, its mechanical rumble unnaturally loud in the pristine morning silence. As we pulled away, I obsessively monitored the forest behind us through the rear window, convinced I would glimpse whoever had delivered this warning. The forest revealed nothing but endless trees gradually obscured by our vehicle's dust cloud. Yet the sensation of being observed persisted with uncomfortable intensity. Anyone want to explain what just happened? Kevin finally broke the silence as we navigated the rough forest road, Jason driving with significantly more speed than prudence warranted. Someone skinned an animal and put it on the truck, Jason stated, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel too forcefully. While we were sleeping. But why? Kevin pressed. What's the point? A warning, I suggested, the idea materializing in my consciousness without conscious development. A message that we weren't welcome. We lapsed into uncomfortable silence after that, each processing the implications differently. The truck bounced violently over exposed roots and depressions, but nobody suggested reducing speed. Physical discomfort seemed trivial compared to the psychological unease permeating the vehicle. When we finally reached paved road approximately 40 minutes later, a collective exhalation of relief escaped us. Civilization, even in this limited form of rural infrastructure, provided illusory security. We maintained our silence for several more miles before Kevin spoke again. Should we report this to the police or Forest Service? Jason considered this briefly. And tell them what? Someone left an animal skin on my truck? They'd ask if anything was stolen or damaged. It was a threat, I insisted. Deliberate intimidation. Maybe, Jason conceded. Or maybe just some local hunters messing with outsiders. Either way, we're not going back. We parted ways at our original meeting point with minimal conversation, transferring our gear to our respective vehicles mechanically. The unspoken agreement was clear. We would process this independently before discussing it further. I watched my friends' vehicles disappear in opposite directions, then sat motionless in my car, hands trembling slightly against the steering wheel. The rational explanation, local hunters or pranksters, failed to resolve my growing unease. Something about the meticulous positioning, the deliberate skinning, suggested purpose beyond simple intimidation. It felt personal, specific, though I couldn't articulate why. The drive home passed in a dissociative blur. Familiar landmarks registered without emotional connection as my mind continuously replayed the morning's discovery. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the gore-streaked truck hood had imprinted itself permanently in my memory, a visceral image that resisted displacement. My wife greeted me with evident surprise. "You're back early? Everything okay?" I manufactured a plausible explanation about deteriorating weather forecasts, unwilling to burden her with the actual circumstances. She accepted this without question, though her expression suggested she sensed the underlying falseness of my account. After unloading my equipment, I immediately turned my attention to my vehicle. Though no blood had touched its surface, I felt compelled to wash it thoroughly, as though contamination might have transferred merely through proximity. I directed the hose with obsessive attention to detail, watching pink-tinged water stream down the driveway until it ran clear. That evening, restlessness drove me to my computer. Initial searches for animal skin left on vehicle and hunting intimidation tactics yielded surprisingly relevant results. I discovered similar incidents documented across rural America. Skinned animals left as warnings, territorial markers, or threats. Most accounts attributed these acts to territorial hunters, protectionist landowners, or local youth engaging in extreme hazing of outsiders. One forum thread particularly captured my attention. A user from eastern Kentucky described finding a perfectly skinned raccoon displayed across their tent while camping in an unmarked area. The subsequent discussion included dozens of similar accounts, spanning decades and multiple states throughout Appalachia and the deeper South. A user identifying as a former Forest Service employee offered historical context. These incidents have occurred for generations in certain remote communities. Originally intended as territorial warnings to encroaching outsiders, they evolved into regional folklore. Many perpetrators today are simply replicating behaviors they've heard about without understanding the original purpose. This rational explanation provided temporary comfort, but failed to address the disquieting precision of our experience. Territorial warnings typically involve simpler methods: slashed tires, equipment theft, verbal confrontations. The methodical skinning and careful display suggested ritualistic elements that commercial hunting practices couldn't explain. Sleep evaded me that night. Each time I approached unconsciousness, my mind projected the image of that glistening skin onto my closed eyelids. I found myself listening intently to normal house-settling sounds, reinterpreting them as potential intrusions. Around 3 a.m., I relocated to the living room couch, unwilling to disturb my wife with my restlessness. Morning arrived with crushing fatigue, but no resolution. I contacted Jason and Kevin individually, discovering they had experienced similar sleep disruption. We agreed to meet that evening to discuss the incident properly. The abbreviated conversation during our hasty departure had left too many aspects unaddressed. The local diner provided neutral territory, its brightly lit interior, and continuous background conversation, creating an environment antithetical to our unsettling experience. Kevin arrived first, the dark circles beneath his eyes mirroring my own. Jason joined shortly after, his typically animated demeanor noticeably subdued. "I've been researching," I began after we'd ordered coffee. "Apparently this isn't uncommon in remote areas, some kind of territorial marking or warning system." Jason nodded. "I spoke with my uncle who used to hunt in those mountains. He's heard stories. Locals leaving skinned animals for people who camp where they shouldn't." "That's supposed to make us feel better?" Kevin questioned. "That someone deliberately targeted us for camping in their hunting grounds?" "Better than the alternatives," Jason replied. The unspoken alternatives hung between us, implications too disturbing to articulate directly. We maintained conversation for nearly 2 hours, analyzing every aspect of the experience without reaching satisfying conclusions. The factual elements were clear. Someone had approached our campsite during the night, deposited a freshly skinned animal carcass on Jason's truck with deliberate care, and departed without disturbing us. The motivation and identity of this individual remained entirely speculative. "I'm not going back out there," Kevin eventually stated with finality. "Not this season, maybe not ever." Neither Jason nor I contested this declaration. The violation of our perceived security had fundamentally altered our relationship with the wilderness. What had previously represented escape and freedom now carried undertones of vulnerability and threat. The following week brought no resolution, only increasing preoccupation. The incident contaminated my daily activities. Unexpected sounds triggered disproportionate startle responses, and periods of darkness induced irrational vigilance. I found myself checking window locks repeatedly before bedtime and installing additional exterior lighting around my home. My wife eventually confronted me about these behavioral changes. "Something happened on that trip that you're not telling me," she stated one evening, her tone indicating this wasn't a question. I hesitated briefly before describing the actual events. Her expression transformed from concern to alarm as I recounted discovering the skin, our hasty departure, and the subsequent research that provided limited context. "You need to report this," she insisted immediately. "That's threatening behavior." "The sheriff's department won't take it seriously," I countered. "No property damage, no explicit threat. They'll file a report and forget about it." Despite my reluctance, her insistence eventually prevailed. The following morning, I contacted the county sheriff's office with jurisdiction over the area where we'd camped. The dispatcher connected me with Deputy Wilson, who listened to my account with professional detachment. "Location?" he requested after I'd finished. I provided approximate coordinates based on our GPS records. "That's Jenkins' property," he remarked after consulting something on his end. "About 800 acres of private forest bordering state land. They allow hunting but not camping." This revelation introduced a new dimension. "We thought it was national forest land. There weren't any posting signs." "Property boundaries out there aren't always clearly marked," Deputy Wilson acknowledged. "The Jenkins family has owned that land for generations. They're particular about trespassers." "Particular enough to leave skinned animals as warnings?" A brief silence preceded his response. "I can't speak to specific tactics, sir. I'll document your report and speak with the property owners about appropriate signage." His tone conveyed clear dismissal. This wasn't a priority concern for rural law enforcement. I pressed further, asking whether similar incidents had been reported previously. "Nothing officially documented," he replied carefully. "But these areas have their own ways of handling outsiders. My recommendation would be to stick to designated camping areas in the future." The conversation provided minimal satisfaction, but confirmed my suspicion that such incidents weren't unprecedented. The Jenkins name offered a concrete entity responsible for the territory, though whether family members themselves had delivered the warning remained unclear. Further online research revealed scattered information about the Jenkins family, regional landowners since the early 1900s, primarily engaged in sustainable timber harvesting and licensed hunting leases. Nothing suggested particular hostility toward outsiders, though several forum posts mentioned their reputation for privacy and territorial protection. A local history website referenced the family's involvement in traditional forest management practices and preservation of regional customs, vague terminology that could encompass virtually any behavior. One archived newspaper article from 1987 described a dispute between Jenkins family representatives and state conservation officials regarding hunting practices, though specific details remained ambiguous. I located 7 additional accounts of skinned animals left as warnings throughout the region, spanning from 1975 to 2020. Most described similar circumstances: remote camping locations, no direct human contact, precisely positioned animal remains discovered in the morning. The consistency across decades suggested established practice rather than random intimidation. A message from Kevin interrupted my research. "Started feeling watched at home, installed security cameras yesterday. Am I going crazy?" The message resonated uncomfortably with my own experience. Since returning, I'd frequently sensed observation without visible cause, a perception I'd attributed to anxiety rather than legitimate threat. Kevin's independent development of similar paranoia suggested something beyond coincidental stress response. "Not crazy," I responded. "Same here. Jason too?" "Called him yesterday. He's keeping a baseball bat beside his bed." The implication disturbed me profoundly. All 3 of us, rational, educated adults, had independently developed paranoid behaviors following our experience. This collective response suggested legitimate trauma rather than individual overreaction. More troubling was the underlying question: what exactly were we afraid of? Territorial hunters would have achieved their objective. We had vacated their land with no intention of returning. Any rational threat had ended with our departure. Yet something about the experience had triggered deeper instinctual responses, awakening primitive fears that modern rationality failed to dismiss. 2 weeks after the incident, unusual occurrences began accumulating around my home. Initially subtle enough to dismiss individually, their collective pattern became increasingly difficult to rationalize. Small items relocated between rooms without explanation. Exterior motion detector lights activated without visible triggers. Unexplained scratching sounds emanated from the attic space during pre-dawn hours. My wife noticed my deteriorating mental state but attributed it to work-related stress rather than connecting it to the camping incident. Her concern manifested as increased patience rather than shared vigilance, creating an isolation that intensified my unease. I couldn't articulate why seemingly minor domestic anomalies triggered such disproportionate anxiety. Jason reported similar experiences during our increasingly frequent phone conversations. "Something was in my garage last night," he confided one evening, voice lowered despite being alone in his home. "Nothing taken, nothing damaged, but things moved, tools rearranged on the workbench." "Could be memory gaps," I suggested, attempting rationality I didn't genuinely feel. "Stress affects cognitive function. I photographed the workbench before bed," he countered. "Compared it this morning. Definite changes." Kevin maintained strategic silence regarding his situation, responding to messages with decreasing frequency. When he finally agreed to meet 3 weeks after the incident, his physical transformation shocked me. Significant weight loss, unkempt appearance, nervous mannerisms previously absent from his typically composed demeanor. "The security cameras captured something," he revealed after ensuring no other patrons could overhear our conversation. 3 nights ago, around 2 a.m. He slid his phone across the table, displaying grainy night vision footage of his rear yard. Initially showing only normal suburban landscaping. At timestamp 2:17 a.m., a shadow detached from the tree line bordering his property. The figure, unmistakably human-shaped but lacking detailed features in the low-resolution recording, stood motionless at the yard's edge for approximately 8 minutes before retreating into the darkness. "Could be anyone," I suggested without conviction. "Neighbor, random trespasser." Kevin retrieved his phone, expression indicating he'd anticipated my skepticism. "It's happened 3 consecutive nights. Same time window, same behavior, just watching the house." The revelation demolished my already fragile rationalization structure. Coincidental neighborhood prowlers might explain an isolated incident, but not recurring episodes targeting multiple individuals connected only by a specific shared experience. "Have you reported it?" "And tell police what? That someone stood at the edge of my property? They'll take a report and forget it immediately." His bitterness mirrored my own experience with law enforcement's response. "We need to consider what we might have encountered," I suggested carefully. "Beyond territorial hunters or landowners." "Don't start with conspiracy theories," Kevin warned. "That's a path to legitimate psychological breakdown." "Not conspiracies," I clarified. "Community practices, regional customs that outsiders aren't meant to understand." This framing resonated with information fragments I had accumulated through research. Isolated rural communities developing independent behavioral systems outside mainstream cultural norms. Throughout Appalachia and similar regions, geographical isolation had historically enabled the preservation of practices abandoned elsewhere. "Whatever's happening," I continued, "it's connected to that land, to the Jenkins property. Something about our presence there triggered a response that hasn't concluded." Kevin considered this perspective, his expression suggesting reluctant acceptance of its plausibility. "So what's the end game? What do they want from us?" The question crystallized our fundamental uncertainty. Traditional territorial warnings achieved their objective through our immediate departure. Extended surveillance and intimidation suggested different motivation, something beyond simple boundary enforcement. Recognition, I proposed, the concept formulating as I articulated it. Acknowledgement that we understand the warning and respect the boundary. Maybe we're supposed to demonstrate that somehow. This theory aligned with anthropological patterns of territorial dispute resolution in traditional societies. Violation required not only cessation, but formal acknowledgement of transgression. Our hasty departure might have satisfied physical removal without fulfilling the cultural requirement for proper acknowledgement. So what? We send an apology letter to a family we've never met for camping on unmarked private property. Kevin's skepticism contained undercurrents of desperate hope for simple resolution. Maybe something more direct, I suggested. Return to the boundary, not the actual property, and leave some form of acknowledgement. Traditional cultures often use symbolic exchanges to resolve territorial violations. The proposal contained obvious risks, but offered potential resolution that avoidance strategies had failed to provide. Kevin's expression registered intense conflict between rational rejection and desperate willingness to try anything that might end the psychological siege. "I'll talk to Jason," I assured him. "We'll approach this methodically." Kevin nodded without verbal agreement, but his posture reflected marginal relaxation, the first reduction in visible tension I'd observed since our meeting began. Whether my theory held validity remained uncertain, but the prospect of proactive response offered psychological benefit independent of actual efficacy. As we parted ways, Kevin gripped my shoulder with unexpected intensity. "Whatever we decide, we stay together on this. No individual heroics." The instruction struck me as uncharacteristically dramatic for his typically reserved personality, yet perfectly aligned with our altered reality. The unspoken understanding between us acknowledged that conventional behavioral norms no longer applied to our situation. We had crossed an invisible boundary and entered territory governed by different rules. Rules we were struggling to decipher before consequences escalated beyond psychological intimidation. The solution crystallized from necessity rather than inspiration. After extensive consultation, Jason, Kevin, and I developed a response plan balancing rational skepticism with acknowledgement of inexplicable experiences. We would return to the general area, maintaining safe distance from the actual Jenkins property, and perform a symbolic acknowledgement of territorial violation and subsequent withdrawal. Research into traditional Appalachian customs provided limited guidance, but suggested the importance of reciprocal exchange, a token or offering representing recognition of established boundaries. The specific form mattered less than the deliberate ritual acknowledgement of transgression and commitment to future avoidance. We selected a neutral location approximately 1 mile from our original campsite, close enough to connect with the territory in question while remaining on clearly marked public land. The date, exactly 1 month after our initial experience, carried no specific significance beyond providing adequate preparation time. "This feels ridiculous," Jason commented as we assembled at the Forest Service trailhead on the appointed morning. Despite his verbal skepticism, his participation confirmed shared desperation for resolution. "Probably is," I acknowledged. "But conventional approaches haven't worked. Sometimes addressing irrational experiences requires stepping outside rational frameworks." Kevin remained silent, his attention directed toward the forest rather than our conversation. His security footage had captured additional nighttime observations during intervening weeks, establishing patterns that defied coincidental explanation. The psychological toll manifested in his physical appearance, significant weight loss, persistent insomnia indicators, hypervigilant posture. Our preparation included documentation of property boundaries to ensure we remained on public land throughout the process. The symbolic offering, a small wooden container containing salt, coins, and locally sourced tobacco, represented traditional elements from regional folklore regarding territorial acknowledgement. The forest presented entirely different characteristics in daylight compared to our memory of pre-dawn discovery. Sunlight penetrated the canopy in distinct shafts, creating illuminated pathways through otherwise shadowed understory. Wildlife sounds, bird calls, rustling vegetation, distant movement, created continuous audio texture that emphasized the previous unnatural silence we'd experienced. We hiked approximately 15 minutes to our designated location, a small clearing beside the official trail where Forest Service boundary markers clearly designated public land. The proximity to Jenkins' property remained tangible despite legal separation, an awareness heightened by our previous experience. "This feels as far as we should go," I suggested, receiving immediate agreement from my companions. The ritual itself manifested as deliberately simplified ceremony. Placement of our offering container at the clearing's edge facing Jenkins' property, followed by verbal acknowledgement of boundary violation and commitment to future respect. The specific wording emerged spontaneously, emphasizing genuine regret for unintentional trespass rather than theatrical performance. "We acknowledge crossing boundaries without permission," I stated toward the forest beyond the clearing. "We recognize this territory belongs to others and commit to respecting those boundaries henceforth." Jason and Kevin added brief personal statements of similar sentiment. The process required less than 10 minutes total, brief enough to seem insufficient, yet significant enough to establish deliberate intent. Whether anyone witnessed our performance remained unknown, though the sensation of observation persisted throughout. "That's it?" Jason questioned as we concluded. "We're just assuming this resolves whatever's happening." "We're acknowledging the possibility that our experience connects to territorial customs we don't fully understand," I clarified. "Whether this specific response addresses those customs correctly remains uncertain." Kevin scanned the surrounding forest with evident apprehension. "Something feels different. Not resolved, but acknowledged." His observation resonated with my own perception. An intangible shift in atmospheric pressure that defied rational explanation but registered on some primitive awareness level. The forest retained its fundamental character but somehow conveyed different energy toward our presence. Assessment rather than hostility. We departed without further ceremony, maintaining silent vigilance during our return hike. The sensation of observation persisted, though its quality had transformed from malevolent surveillance to neutral documentation. Whether this perception reflected actual external change or psychological projection remained indeterminable. The subsequent weeks brought gradual reduction in unexplained occurrences. Kevin reported no further night visitors captured on security footage. Jason's domestic anomalies ceased entirely. My own hypervigilance diminished incrementally, eventually returning to normal awareness patterns without conscious effort. We maintained regular communication throughout this period, documenting changes with scientific detachment that belied our emotional investment in resolution. By the 6th week following our acknowledgement ceremony, all 3 of us reported returning to normal sleep patterns and significantly reduced anxiety levels. "So was it real or mass psychosis?" Jason questioned during our final formal discussion of the experience. "Both possibilities feature equally implausible elements," I replied. Either multiple independent observers experienced identical hallucinations, or traditional territorial practices include elements mainstream culture can't incorporate into its belief systems. Kevin, whose recovery had progressed most dramatically, offered pragmatic perspective. "The observable reality is that something placed a skinned animal on Jason's truck while we slept. Everything after that involved our interpretation of that event, whether driven by external forces or internal psychology, ultimately makes little practical difference." This conclusion, while unsatisfying from purely rational perspective, provided functional resolution that allowed reintegration into normal life patterns. We achieved consensus that regardless of ultimate explanation, the experience warranted respect rather than dismissal, an encounter with forces beyond conventional understanding that demanded appropriate acknowledgement. I sometimes wake from dreams featuring that glistening skin displayed across metal, perfectly centered and deliberately positioned. The image retains its emotional impact despite temporal distance, triggering momentary disorientation before rational context reasserts itself. These episodes have diminished in frequency, but persist as permanent psychological imprints, reminders of boundaries crossed and lessons painfully acquired. We haven't returned to those woods, nor do we intend to. Some territories remain better respectfully avoided, their boundaries acknowledged without challenge. The wilderness contains more than physical danger. It preserves ancient understanding that modern perspective has forgotten rather than transcended. Sometimes warnings deserve heeding without demanding explanation, and some messages communicate across cultural boundaries that rational discourse cannot bridge. The forest remembers what civilization has forgotten. Those who dwell at the boundaries between these worlds maintain traditions that protect separation necessary for both to survive. We crossed that boundary unknowingly and received appropriate response, a message delivered in primal language that even modern minds could not misinterpret. That knowledge remains our most valuable souvenir. From an expedition that taught us wilderness extends beyond physical territory into realms of understanding where different rules apply. Some boundaries exist for valid reasons, and proper respect acknowledges not only their existence, but the wisdom behind their establishment. I have always found peace in isolation. As a 29-year-old woman living in an urban landscape constantly buzzing with activity, I discovered early that my energy depletes rapidly in crowds and regenerates in solitude. The endless stream of social interactions and obligations that constitute modern life often left me overwhelmed and yearning for escape. Not the kind of escape that involves exotic destinations or elaborate plans, but rather the simple act of being alone in nature, surrounded by trees instead of buildings, listening to birdsong instead of car horns. The conservation area became my sanctuary approximately 18 months ago. Located adjacent to the Pinehurst Golf Club and bordered by the Riverside subdivision, this modest woodland offered an accessible retreat just 15 minutes from my apartment. What made it particularly appealing was how surprisingly empty it could be during certain hours or weather conditions that deterred casual visitors. My colleagues often expressed concern about my solitary excursions. "Isn't it dangerous to go there alone?" they would ask with genuine worry. I would explain that the area was well patrolled, with signs indicating surveillance cameras throughout the property. The proximity to residential areas and the regular presence of dog walkers and photographers made it feel secure despite its natural setting. In truth, I never felt threatened there until November of last year. My preference for visiting during unpopular hours developed organically. I discovered that early mornings on weekdays, late afternoons when the temperature dropped, or during light precipitation significantly reduced the number of visitors. These conditions created the perfect environment for me to decompress. The fewer people I encountered, the more authentic my connection with nature felt. Looking back now, I recognize how my quest for solitude inadvertently increased my vulnerability. The very conditions I sought, fewer witnesses, reduced visibility, challenging weather, created the perfect opportunity for someone with malicious intent. At the time, however, I believed I was making reasonable choices. After all, I still visited during daylight hours and remained in a managed conservation area with nearby civilization. The rhythm of these visits became therapeutic for me. Each week I would identify days with suboptimal weather forecasts and plan my visits accordingly. I documented bird sightings, practiced outdoor skills, and simply allowed myself to exist without the constant stimulation of modern life. Sometimes I brought a sketchbook, other times a field guide for local flora. Occasionally I brought nothing at all, preferring to walk mindfully through the landscape, absorbing its details without artificial filters. November brought shorter days and colder temperatures, conditions that typically guaranteed me the privacy I craved. The conservation area transformed during this season, shedding its vibrant autumn colors for more subdued tones of brown and gray. The reduced foliage offered clearer sightlines through the woods, which I appreciated for wildlife spotting. It never occurred to me that this improved visibility worked both ways, making me equally observable to anyone watching from a distance. The Riverside Conservation Area spans approximately 200 acres, a modest size compared to state parks, but substantial enough to create a sense of immersion in nature. The primary trail forms a figure-8 pattern, with various smaller paths branching off into specific ecosystems. Wetlands to the east, deciduous forest in the center, and the pine plantation to the northwest. The area's diversity within a relatively compact space made it ideal for regular visits, as each section offered different experiences throughout the seasons. The pine plantation particularly fascinated me. Unlike the rest of the conservation area, which followed natural succession patterns, the plantation represented human intervention. Orderly rows of mature pine trees planted decades ago for timber harvest that never occurred due to changing land management policies. The trees stood tall and uniform, creating cathedral-like spaces between their trunks. The ground beneath remained relatively clear except for a thick carpet of russet pine needles, making it easier to walk through than the denser undergrowth elsewhere. The plantation existed off the official trail network, requiring deliberate navigation to reach. Most visitors stuck to marked paths, making this section particularly deserted. I appreciated how the acoustics changed there, the pine needles absorbing sound and creating a profound stillness unlike anywhere else in the conservation area. The air carried a distinct resinous scent, especially potent on warmer days or after rain when the moisture activated the aromatics in the needles. During previous visits, I had spotted an owl residing in this section, a barred owl that seemed relatively habituated to human presence if one approached carefully. The sighting had thrilled me, and I documented it meticulously in my nature journal, including sketches and behavioral notes. Finding the owl again became one of my objectives during subsequent visits. The main parking lot served as the primary access point, with space for approximately 20 vehicles. On typical weekends, the lot filled to capacity, but during inclement weather or weekday afternoons, finding it nearly empty wasn't unusual. A bulletin board displayed trail maps, wildlife alerts, and notices about conservation activities. Multiple signs warned visitors about surveillance cameras throughout the property, a detail that had previously provided comfort rather than raising questions about why such security was necessary. I had established familiar patterns during my visits. I would park, check the bulletin board for any new notices, and then head directly to whichever section matched my mood or objectives for the day. The pine plantation had become a frequent destination, particularly when I wanted to practice navigation skills or search for the resident owl. Its location approximately half a mile from the parking lot meant few casual visitors ventured there, especially during unpleasant weather. In retrospect, I realize how predictable my behavior had become. Anyone observing the area regularly could anticipate where a solitary visitor might head, particularly one who clearly valued isolation. The very routines that brought me comfort created a vulnerability I had never considered, a pattern that could be studied and exploited. November 8th arrived with a particular atmospheric moodiness that I found appealing. Temperatures hovering around 40 degrees, a light drizzle that discouraged most outdoor enthusiasts, and a dense fog that transformed the familiar landscape into something more atmospheric. Perfect conditions for solitude. I arrived at approximately 4:15 p.m., knowing daylight would begin fading within 2 hours, but confident I could complete my planned activities before darkness set in. The parking lot appeared empty from a distance, exactly as I had hoped. As I pulled in, however, I noticed a vehicle positioned in the far corner, a blue pickup truck with mud splattered across its lower panels and wheel wells. The make and model weren't immediately apparent through the foggy conditions, but its presence registered as unusual. Typically, the few vehicles present during inclement weather belonged to dog walkers, who generally drove sedans or small SUVs. A figure sat in the driver's seat, visible as a dark silhouette behind rain-streaked windows. I felt the weight of observation as I gathered my backpack and locked my car, though I couldn't definitively confirm the person was watching me. The sensation triggered a momentary unease that I quickly dismissed. Public parking lots naturally create situations where people observe others. Nothing inherently threatening existed in the scenario. My agenda that afternoon centered on practicing navigation skills with a compass I had recently purchased. The conservation area provided an ideal training ground, familiar enough to prevent actually becoming lost, but varied enough to present legitimate navigational challenges. The pine plantation, with its grid-like arrangement of trees, offered perfect conditions for practicing straight-line travel and triangulation techniques. I followed the main trail for approximately 10 minutes before reaching the unmarked access point leading to the plantation. No official sign marked this transition, only subtle indicators familiar to regular visitors, a slight widening in the understory, a game trail more prominent than others, the visible shift in tree species ahead. I checked my compass and identified my first landmark, a particularly tall pine approximately 300 yards ahead that stood slightly apart from its neighbors. The transition from trail to off-trail travel required pushing through a section of denser vegetation that formed a natural boundary around the plantation. The recent rain amplified every sound, branches scraping against my jacket, my boots squelching in mud, the persistent patter of droplets striking leaves. These natural sounds masked other movements, creating an auditory vulnerability I hadn't considered. Approximately halfway to my targeted landmark, a distinct sound broke through the ambient noise, branches snapping and undergrowth rustling in a pattern inconsistent with wildlife movement. The directionality indicated the sound originated from the trail access point I had used minutes earlier. I turned, expecting to see a dog walker who had decided to venture off trail. Instead, I saw him, the driver from the blue pickup truck. He stood partially obscured by the boundary vegetation, wearing a dark green rain jacket with the hood pulled up, obscuring much of his face. His posture suggested he had frozen mid-step when I turned, creating an unnaturally still silhouette against the mist-shrouded background. The distance between us, perhaps 70 yards, should have provided comfort, but something about his positioning created immediate discomfort. The pine plantation entrance lay well off the main trail circuit, requiring deliberate deviation from the marked path. No casual walker would have randomly selected this particular direction without specific purpose. Instinctive alarm triggered within me, immediately tempered by rational counter-arguments. I had diagnosed anxiety that occasionally manufactured threats where none existed. The conservation area remained open to all visitors. No one needed justification for exploring any section. Perhaps he simply found the plantation interesting as I did. Perhaps he sought shelter from the rain beneath the dense canopy. To test my suspicion, I abruptly altered course, turning 180 degrees and walking directly back toward the main trail. This decision abandoned my navigation practice but would reveal whether his presence represented coincidence or concerning pattern. A legitimate hiker would likely continue their own trajectory, perhaps puzzled by my sudden departure but unaffected by it. He followed. Not immediately, but after a brief hesitation, his path adjusted to mirror mine. I increased my pace slightly, not rushing but moving purposefully. When I reached the denser boundary vegetation, I pushed through quickly and returned to the main trail, then paused, as if consulting my compass. Through peripheral vision, I observed him emerging from the same vegetation screen moments later. The sequence of events defied innocent explanation. The plantation covered substantial acreage. No reason existed for him to exit at precisely the same point unless he was tracking my movements. He maintained approximately 50 feet of distance, close enough to keep visual contact, but far enough to appear non-threatening to potential observers. I abandoned any pretense of normal activity and walked briskly toward the parking lot, no longer stopping to observe surroundings or check my compass. The 10-minute inbound journey collapsed to 7 minutes on the return. Throughout this retreat, awareness of his continued presence registered through occasional glimpses and the sound of footsteps maintaining consistent distance. Reaching the parking lot provided no relief. His truck remained in the corner spot, and as I hurried to my vehicle, I felt his gaze tracking my movements. I drove away, taking an intentionally circuitous route home, watching my rearview mirror for any sign of a blue pickup truck following. None appeared, but the experience left me profoundly disturbed. The week following the incident transformed ordinary activities into exercises in hypervigilance. I found myself scanning parking lots for blue pickup trucks, studying the faces of men in public spaces, and second-guessing my established routines. Sleep became fragmented, interrupted by replays of the encounter that morphed into more threatening scenarios than what actually occurred. Despite this disruption, I gradually began rationalizing the experience. Perhaps he had indeed been looking for the same owl I had previously spotted, having heard about it through local birding networks. Perhaps he actually lived nearby and regularly walked that section, explaining his familiarity with the off-trail area. Perhaps my obvious discomfort had made him uncomfortable, causing him to leave when I did out of social awkwardness rather than malicious intent. I discussed the incident with 2 friends over coffee, carefully describing the sequence of events and my interpretation. Their responses illustrated the spectrum of reaction such situations typically generate. One friend insisted I should never return to the conservation area alone, while the other suggested I was overreacting to a harmless coincidence. Neither perspective fully resonated with my own uncertainty. "The thing is," I explained to them, "nothing actually happened. He didn't approach me, didn't speak to me, didn't threaten me. He just walked in the same area I did." "That's how it starts," my cautious friend countered. "Predators test boundaries before escalating." "Or maybe he's just a guy who likes walking in the woods," my other friend offered. "You said yourself it's a public space." Their conflicting viewpoints mirrored my internal debate. Had I experienced a genuine threat or manufactured one from ambiguous circumstances? The uncertainty itself became exhausting, carrying the emotional weight of a threatening encounter, while simultaneously questioning whether the threat existed at all. 5 days after the incident, I decided to return to the conservation area, partly to reclaim my sense of safety in a place that had provided such comfort, and partly to prove to myself that coincidence, not targeting, explained the previous encounter. I selected a different time slot, late morning rather than late afternoon, and checked weather forecasts to ensure conditions differed from the previous visit. Sunshine replaced rain, though temperatures remained cold. This visit proceeded without incident. I stayed on marked trails, encountered several other visitors, including a birding group, and saw no sign of a blue pickup truck in the parking lot. The experience partially restored my confidence, suggesting the previous encounter represented an isolated incident rather than a pattern. The incident began fading into memory, classified as unsettling but ultimately inconsequential. 10 days later, the sighting of a barred owl outside my apartment complex rekindled my interest in wildlife observation. The conservation area's resident owl came to mind, and I decided to make another visit specifically to search for it. A critical error in judgment followed. I reverted to my previous visitation pattern, late afternoon timing to align with owl activity periods. Weather selection favoring isolation, a cold, damp day following overnight rain, and destination choice prioritizing the pine plantation where I had previously spotted the owl. Without consciously acknowledging it, I recreated conditions nearly identical to those during the concerning encounter, albeit 2 weeks removed. November 24th arrived with a penetrating chill and saturated landscape. Overnight rain had ceased, but heavy cloud cover retained moisture in the atmosphere, creating a clinging dampness that penetrated layers of clothing. The conservation area's parking lot contained just 2 vehicles when I arrived at 3:45 p.m. A red sedan with heavily tinted windows parked near the trailhead and a gray hatchback positioned closer to the exit. No blue pickup truck appeared present, allowing me to exhale tension I hadn't realized I was holding. Equipment for this visit included binoculars, a small field notebook, and the same compass from my previous navigation practice. My objective focused entirely on relocating the barred owl, which previous observations suggested would become active as daylight diminished. I knew returning to the pine plantation meant revisiting the location of my uncomfortable encounter, but rational assessment suggested minimal risk given the different circumstances and absence of the blue truck. The main trail appeared transformed by recent precipitation. Sections normally firm underfoot had become slick with mud, requiring careful navigation of puddles and saturated areas. The dampened environment absorbed sound, creating an unusual stillness interrupted only by occasional water droplets falling from branches. Few fallen leaves remained, the majority having been plastered to the ground by rain or removed by maintenance crews earlier in the season. Approximately 20 feet along the trail, the distinctive sound of footsteps registered behind me. Someone else had entered the trail shortly after I had. The timing seemed coincidental rather than concerning, likely another visitor who had arrived while I organized my equipment. I continued at my established pace, expecting the follower to either overtake me or divert onto one of the alternative paths that branched from the main trail. Neither occurred. For several minutes, the footsteps maintained consistent distance, matching my pace precisely. When I paused briefly to observe a woodpecker working on a dead tree, the sounds behind me ceased. When I resumed walking, so did they. The pattern triggered uncomfortable déjà vu, but I reminded myself that coincidental timing explained the parallel movement. The trail offered limited options until reaching the first major junction approximately a quarter mile ahead. Reaching that junction, I deliberately selected the less traveled path leading toward the pine plantation rather than continuing on the popular loop trail. This decision point would reveal whether the person behind me happened to share my destination or was deliberately matching my movements. I quickened my pace slightly after making the turn, putting additional distance between us. The sounds of pursuit momentarily faded, suggesting the follower had continued on the main path. Relief lasted approximately 30 seconds before I detected renewed movement behind me, quieter now, as though attempting to mask their approach. I maintained my forward trajectory while mentally calculating options. The pine plantation lay ahead approximately 200 yards, offering clear sight lines but fewer escape routes than the more developed trail system. Reversing course would force direct confrontation with whoever followed. Continuing forward at least provided familiar territory and potential access to the secondary exit on the plantation's far side. I reached the boundary vegetation screening the plantation and pushed through quickly, deliberately selecting a different entry point than during my previous visit. The plantation's organized pattern of trees came into view, their straight rows extending into foggy distance. Moisture clung to pine needles, occasional droplets falling when breezes disturbed branches. Perfect conditions for owl activity. Terrible conditions for human visibility and orientation. A rustling sound emanated from the boundary vegetation behind me. I turned sharply, anticipating the worst. The boundary foliage parted, and a figure stepped through, a man wearing the same dark green rain jacket I had seen 2 weeks earlier. Recognition hit simultaneously from both directions. His posture stiffened when he realized I had turned to face him directly. The distance between us, perhaps 30 yards, allowed clear visual confirmation that this was indeed the same individual from the blue pickup truck. Medium height and build, approximately mid-40s, with a day's growth of facial hair visible beneath his hood. Nothing particularly remarkable about his appearance except the context. His presence in exactly the same unusual location as our previous encounter. Coincidence became impossible to rationalize. The conservation area covered extensive acreage with numerous trails and features. The pine plantation represented a specific off-trail destination requiring deliberate navigation to locate. His appearance in this precise location, following the same person he had followed previously, defied statistical probability. Immediate fear threatened to paralyze my decision-making. I forced myself to appear calm while assessing options. Direct confrontation seemed unwise given the isolation. Retreat along the same path would require passing directly by him. The most viable option involved moving deeper into the plantation toward the location where I had previously spotted the owl, then circling around to reach the secondary exit path. I turned and walked purposefully toward a recognizable cluster of trees approximately 100 yards distant, where the owl had nested during previous observation. This movement led deeper into the plantation rather than toward immediate escape, but it created distance while I formulated a more comprehensive exit strategy. Upon reaching the owl's previous location, I made a show of scanning the trees with binoculars while monitoring the man's movements through peripheral vision. He maintained distance but clearly tracked my position, moving parallel rather than directly toward me. His behavior suggested a predatory pattern, maintaining visual contact while avoiding actions that might trigger immediate flight. As I lowered my binoculars, movement registered from an unexpected direction. A second man appeared approximately 50 yards to my right, emerging from between rows of pines. Older than the first man, perhaps mid-50s, with glasses and a bald head visible beneath a navy blue cap. He wore khaki pants and a brown waxed cotton jacket, typical of outdoor enthusiasts. The presence of a second person initially triggered relief, a potential witness or assistance if needed. This perception shattered when I observed the two men exchange a subtle nod of acknowledgement. The coordination confirmed my worst fears. This was not random coincidence, but deliberate targeting involving multiple participants. The strategy became immediately clear. They had positioned themselves to limit my escape options. The first man blocked the path back to the main trail, while the second had appeared along the route toward the secondary exit. Their positioning suggested familiarity with both the territory and my likely movement patterns. The realization triggered profound terror. These men had not only followed me today, but had planned this encounter based on observed behavior. Maintaining external composure while internally processing this information required immense effort. I forced a neutral expression and casual posture while rapidly evaluating alternatives. The plantation's grid layout meant multiple potential paths existed, even if the most obvious routes appeared blocked. The men's positioning suggested they anticipated my awareness of the two formal exits, but might not expect knowledge of unofficial access points. I began walking diagonally across the plantation, selecting a direction that appeared random, but actually led toward a maintenance access point I had discovered during previous explorations. This route initially led away from both the parking lot and residential areas, potentially confusing my pursuers about my intended destination. The first man began moving more directly toward me, abandoning pretense of coincidental presence. The second man adjusted his position to maintain the flanking arrangement. Their movement patterns confirmed coordinated action rather than independent activities. The distance between us, still substantial enough to prevent immediate interception, had begun decreasing. Reaching a particularly dense stand of pines, I abruptly increased my pace to a rapid walk, utilizing the momentary visual obstruction to create confusion about my direction. I angled sharply toward the maintenance access, while the denser vegetation temporarily obscured direct sight lines. The change in pace and direction bought precious seconds of advantage. As I approached the maintenance access, essentially a narrow break in the boundary vegetation where equipment occasionally entered, the sound of accelerated movement behind me confirmed my pursuers had realized my strategy. The first man had broken into a jog, attempting to intercept my path before I reached the boundary. I pushed through the access point and emerged onto an unmaintained service road that connected to the main parking area through a circuitous route. The muddy conditions that had earlier seemed unpleasant now provided critical advantage. The churned earth recorded clear footprints, meaning my pursuers would know exactly which direction I had taken. Rather than attempting to hide my trail, I used this knowledge strategically, moving rapidly along the obvious path while planning to divert suddenly when opportunity presented. That opportunity arrived approximately 200 yards along the service road, where it crossed a shallow seasonal stream. I followed the road across the stream, deliberately leaving clear tracks, then continued 20 yards beyond before cutting sharply into the underbrush and doubling back. I entered the stream itself, using the watercourse as a trackless path that paralleled the service road while concealing my presence. The gambit succeeded. Minutes later, both men hurried past my position along the service road, following the misleading tracks. Their faces now clearly visible, expressions revealing frustration and focused determination rather than casual interest. They continued along the false trail while I remained motionless in the shallow water, partially concealed by overhanging vegetation. When sufficient distance separated us, I carefully extracted myself from the stream and moved perpendicular to the service road, taking a direct route toward the parking area through untracked forest. The navigation skills I had been practicing now served critical purpose, allowing orientation without established paths. I reached the parking lot approximately 15 minutes later, soaking wet from mid-calf down and covered with patches of mud but otherwise unharmed. The two vehicles previously noted remained present, the red sedan with tinted windows and the gray hatchback. An additional vehicle had appeared, the blue pickup truck, now parked directly beside my car in what appeared to be deliberate intimidation or attempt to block easy departure. The immediate priority involved documenting identifying information before potential confrontation. I extracted a small notepad from my jacket pocket and rapidly recorded license plate numbers for all three vehicles, along with basic descriptions. This action, performed in plain view, served dual purpose, creating evidence and signaling to any observers that I had taken precautionary measures. No one appeared immediately present in the parking lot, suggesting my pursuers remained on the service road following the false trail. This temporary advantage provided opportunity for departure before their return. I moved quickly to my vehicle, entered, and locked the doors immediately. As I prepared to depart, movement at the trailhead caught my attention. The first man, the one from the blue pickup truck, emerged from the trail, breathing heavily from exertion. He spotted me immediately and began moving toward the parking lot with purposeful strides. His appearance suggested he had separated from his companion and taken a more direct route back upon discovering the deception. I started my engine and began backing out, intentionally angling away from the approaching figure. He accelerated to a run, attempting to reach the lot before I could exit. As I completed the maneuver and shifted into drive, he arrived at his truck and quickly entered it. I pulled onto the access road leading away from the conservation area, watching through my rearview mirror as the blue pickup's headlights illuminated. The conservation area's access road connected to Riverside Drive, a moderately traveled two-lane road that provided multiple route options. I selected the direction leading toward commercial areas rather than residential zones, prioritizing public spaces with potential witnesses. The blue pickup appeared in my rearview mirror, maintaining consistent distance as I navigated the winding road. At the intersection with Hampton Boulevard, the truck pulled alongside my vehicle while waiting for the traffic light. The driver, now clearly visible without his hood, stared directly at me while raising a smartphone, apparently taking photographs. The intrusion felt violating even through the barrier of glass and metal separating us. When the light changed, I accelerated and turned right toward the shopping district while he performed an illegal U-turn and drove rapidly in the opposite direction. The sudden termination of pursuit provided no immediate relief. The man now possessed photographs, potentially including my license plate, while I had temporarily escaped physical proximity, but not the broader threat. I drove to Riverside Park, a populated public space with continuous activity, and remained there for nearly an hour, watching for any sign of the vehicles I had documented. When confidence in immediate safety returned, I contacted local police using the non-emergency line and arranged to file a report. The responding officer documented the incidents thoroughly, but expressed limited optimism about immediate action. Without direct threats or physical contact, this falls into a gray area legally, he explained. We'll increase patrols around the conservation area and run the plates you provided. But I want you to have realistic expectations about outcomes. I provided my documentation, including vehicle descriptions, license plates, and detailed accounts of both encounters. The officer's questions revealed both professional diligence and subtle skepticism, reasonable given the subjective nature of perceived threats without overt actions. He concluded our meeting with standard safety advice: vary routines, maintain awareness, consider self-defense training, notify friends of whereabouts. Upon returning home, I implemented immediate security measures, checking locks, closing blinds, reviewing apartment complex security features. The physical displacement felt minor compared to psychological impact. Every environmental sound registered as potential threat. Ordinary activities became exercises in hypervigilance. Sleep arrived only after exhaustion overwhelmed anxiety, interrupted frequently by jarring returns to consciousness triggered by normal building noises, reinterpreted as intrusion. 3 months have passed since the second encounter. The police investigation identified the owner of the blue pickup truck through registration records, but found insufficient evidence to pursue charges. The detective assigned to the case informed me that the individual had a previous complaint filed against him for similar behavior in a different jurisdiction. Information that validated my experience while emphasizing how such cases often fall short of actionable legal thresholds. The second man was never identified. The gray hatchback had been reported stolen 2 days prior to the incident and was recovered abandoned approximately 20 miles from the conservation area the following day. The red sedan with tinted windows yielded no useful information, likely unconnected to the individuals involved, simply another visitor coincidentally present. Physical safety has remained intact, but psychological well-being continues requiring active management. I relocated to a different apartment complex with enhanced security features, gated access, surveillance cameras, and on-site management. My routines have transformed to prioritize populated areas and group activities rather than solitary experiences. The conservation area that once provided refuge now represents threat. I have not returned despite occasional longing for the natural spaces it contained. Professional counseling has provided crucial support for processing the experience and managing resultant anxiety. The therapist specializing in trauma response identified specific patterns in my reaction, hypervigilance, sleep disruption, avoidance behaviors, and developed targeted strategies for addressing each component. Progress occurs incrementally rather than transformatively, measured in moments of decreased vigilance and increased comfort in public spaces. The most profound loss involves the dissolution of solitude as restorative practice. The essential isolation that previously recharged internal resources now triggers immediate threat response. Attempts to recapture this experience in alternative locations, different parks, indoor sanctuaries, private gardens, have yielded limited success. The association between isolation and vulnerability appears fundamentally altered, perhaps permanently. Friends have responded with varying degrees of understanding and support. Some immediately incorporated protective behaviors, offering accompaniment for outdoor activities, checking in regularly, researching security measures. Others expressed difficulty comprehending the impact of an experience where nothing actually happened. This dichotomy mirrors internal struggle, reconciling profound psychological impact with absence of physical harm. The investigating detective provided context that simultaneously validated and disturbed. Predatory individuals often select victims based on predictable isolation and established patterns, she explained during our final follow-up meeting. Your situational awareness and quick thinking likely prevented escalation. Most people don't recognize the danger until too late. This professional assessment confirmed what instinct had signaled. The encounters represented genuine threat rather than misinterpreted coincidence. The validation provided cold comfort against lingering questions. How long had they observed before engaging? What outcomes did they intend? How many others had they targeted using similar methods? The absence of answers leaves space for imagination to construct worst-case scenarios that counseling techniques cannot fully dispel. Practical changes extend beyond location and routines. I purchased personal security devices, pepper spray, alarm systems, tracking applications that share location with designated contacts. Self-defense classes provided basic physical techniques alongside psychological preparation. These measures offer tangible protection while symbolizing a fundamental shift in worldview, from basic assumption of safety to expectation of potential threat. The most difficult aspect involves explaining this transformation to others who haven't experienced similar violations of security. "You're being paranoid," a coworker commented after I declined an invitation to an evening walk along an urban trail. The statement itself validates the pre-incident perspective, that precaution equals overreaction, that threat requires demonstration before warranting response. I no longer share this luxury of assumption. If meaningful resolution exists, it emerges not through forgetting, but through integration, incorporating the experience into a revised understanding of reality without allowing it to dominate all aspects of existence. Certain activities remain restricted or modified, certain locations permanently avoided. Yet gradually, carefully, with appropriate safeguards, new patterns develop that accommodate both increased awareness and continued engagement with life's essential experiences. The conservation area's pine plantation occasionally appears in dreams, sometimes as idyllic space recaptured, sometimes as setting for imagined worst outcomes. Both versions represent processing rather than prediction. The actual location continues existing independent of my experience there, with visitors enjoying its spaces unaware of specific history. This disconnection between personal significance and objective reality underscores how individual experiences reshape environments through perception. I still seek moments of controlled solitude, brief intervals in secure environments where external stimulation recedes and internal calm emerges. These experiences differ qualitatively from previous immersions but fulfill similar functions in diminished form. Adaptation continues, balance gradually reestablishes, and time creates distance from acute experience without erasing essential lessons. The men who followed me that day altered my relationship with solitude and security in ways they likely never considered while pursuing whatever objective motivated their actions. But they did not secure ultimate victory. Fear transforms, but does not define. Caution replaces naivety without eliminating joy. I move through the world differently now, more aware, more prepared, more conscious of potential threats, but I continue moving forward nonetheless.